From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, June 13. This week, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese gave a big speech at the National Press Club in Canberra and used it to dangle the prospect of economic reform. During its first term, the Albanese government was criticised for not being bold enough in its agenda. So is the PM signalling he will use his huge majority to institute major reform? What would a daring economic reform agenda look like? And are Australians even ready for it? Plus, we discuss the hardening of the government's stance on Israel after it imposed sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers. Here to discuss all this today, we have our Chief Political Correspondent, Paul Sakkal, as well as our special guest star, Senior Economics Correspondent, Shane Wright. Welcome, gentlemen.
I want to see special guest star in the paper as my byline from now on. That's it. Thank you, Jackie.
Well, as we've previously discussed, you're the Heather Locklear of this podcast, which people who ever watched Melrose Place will understand. No one else will.
I want to know what that makes Paul Sakkal.
What's the reference there? In what way are they similar?
Heather Locklear used to be the special guest star. That was her billing on Melrose Place, which is a very popular show in the 1990s, Paul.
I'm aware of the show. Less convinced by Shane's specialness, but let's get stuck into the questions.
Well, let's test it out. Let's test that theory. Paul, the Prime Minister gave a speech at the National Press Club this week. It was his first major agenda-setting speech since his landslide victory in May. What did he say in summary?
It was his second press club speech in the space of only a couple of months. He did one during the election campaign, maybe even less than a couple of months, which is quite rare to do press club speeches in such quick succession.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be back at the National Press Club. And
I think he had a couple of big themes. A big kind of grander theme was this idea from him that a stable majority Labor government that sticks to its commitments, that governs with a level of maturity, that avoids populism, is an Australian antidote to what we're seeing in other parts of the world where there are more frazzled kind of political environments. He's made a virtue of respecting the free press, of this idea that he is governing for all people, and he really kind of, got stuck into that argument, which we heard a little bit of pre-campaign.
He's sort of making a virtue of the contrast between him and a certain other administration that's currently firing rubber bullets at journalists on the streets of LA.
Exactly, and took a pretty striking step of making an official complaint, diplomatic complaint to US officials about that Channel 9 journalist who was hit with a rubber bullet, which was, not an action he needed to take. He also called Lauren Tomasi, the journalist. He kind of went above and beyond, which, as you say, is a signal to the US administration that we're not that pleased with what we're seeing. And that's quite a bold thing to do, given the Prime Minister might be about to meet the President next week at a G7 summit on the sidelines, which has not actually been locked in but is widely expected.
Yeah, okay. So he also had an economic agenda, or he sort of turned to the economic agenda. Obviously, during the Prime Minister's first term in government, there was a lot of criticism that their agenda wasn't bold enough, particularly on the economic front. Did we hear something different about Albo 2.0, Shane?
We did. Like Albo 1, or the original Albo, the government's focus was on inflation and making sure unemployment didn't go through the roof as the war on inflation continued. And in that case, Albanese did effectively say mission accomplished with inflation at 2.4. The unemployment rate is at 4.1. About 1 million people have got jobs the last 3 years. So on that front, yep. But, us economic nerds, we want more. We are the Oliver Twists of politics, saying we want more in terms particularly around productivity.
we want to build an economy where growth, wages and productivity all rise together.
And this is where he got into his surprising announcement that he has told Jim Chalmers, hold a summit. We love summits. Roundtables, whatever term you want to use, to talk about productivity in August.
They called it a roundtable. We called it a summit because it sounded more important, I think.
Yeah, I don't know where it ranks. I think this is part of the reason for Australia's productivity malaise is the fact that we're debating the nomenclature.
We should have a whole podcast on summits versus roundtables and what's the difference between the two. We hear a lot about productivity, Shane, because economists and people like yourself love to talk about it. It sends most of the rest of the population to sleep, but You guys seem to think it's really important, and we hear a lot about how productivity growth is low in this country. What does productivity mean as an economic term, and why do we care if productivity growth is low?
Easy definition, inputs versus outputs. So we'll use Paul Sakkal as an example, okay? What it does not mean is Paul Sakkal working longer and longer hours and producing more stories. It is Paul Sakkal, same, like he does work long. So let's say he works a 10-hour day, producing more output or even better output within his 10-hour day. And it's how he does it. This is why we talk about productivity. So our world is built on productivity.
So why does Australia have low productivity growth in comparison to other countries?
We don't in comparison to other countries, bar one country. And this has been one of the great it's one of the great economic conundrums of the last 20 years, is that productivity has been slowing across the world. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a real big lift in the United States. Part of that is due to measurement. They don't measure productivity quite the way everybody else does. But something has gone on in the United States. A lot of people think it's due to artificial intelligence. Part of it is the fact that all these people have dropped out of the jobs market in low productivity areas.
It's such a shame that productivity, the word, puts people to sleep, because in the long run, and this is just a truism of economics, incomes and prosperity does not grow over time unless you do things more efficiently. So it is fundamentally the most important thing.
He wants to change the economic language.
Well, I think
now.
the economists should get in a room with some ad guys and come up with a better way of explaining
Make it a bit more
this.
jazzy. We need a jazzier term.
Jazz hands for productivity.
We can flag that.
Because it affects how politicians behave.
We've flagged that for another podcast. So anyway, we've got this problem with productivity growth, which turns out is a bit of a global problem. If we want to improve living standards and improve our lives, then we need to look at it. The Prime Minister has pledged a dreaded roundtable or an economic summit. I mean, what is the point of these summits, Paul? Doesn't Treasury already have modelling, and the Productivity Commission for that matter, on every single possible economic reform or tax change that we could possibly want to make? These things often feel quite performative and a little bit unnecessary. Am I being too cynical?
No, well, you're right. There has been a litany of reviews and examinations from different departments and the Productivity Commission over the years. So a lot of the ideas are known. And this was the other big takeout from the speech. The speech notes were dropped out on the Monday from the Prime Minister's office, and that was just a small segment of the speech, and that really focused on how the government would be super focused on delivering its commitments, and it was not really contemplating going further. It was going to be a government that was orderly and wasn't going to shift beyond the guardrails that it set for itself. But then in the speech, Albanese gave at least an implicit acknowledgement that more can be done on the economy, that the election commitments are important and, in his view, bold, but more can be done to grow the place, and there might be a greater emphasis in this government on growth because there is now space to focus on growth given the inflation crisis has been put to bed, or hopefully put to bed.
This work is already underway, including our National Productivity Fund, incentivising state and territory governments to drive efficiencies in construction.
And so, yes, there are a bunch of ideas out there. A lot of those ideas, particularly those raised by drier economists and our friends in some of the more drier conservative parts of the media, are heavily focused on lowering taxes and making the IR system more flexible, which is another way of saying giving workers relatively fewer rights. They are not easy to prosecute on the left side of politics.
Well, and also the Prime Minister specifically kind of ruled that out. I mean, he said that workers getting a fair crack, in his words, is not something that we will abandon.
I'm a Labor Prime Minister and I support penalty rates. I'm a Labor Prime Minister and I support real wages increasing.
So they obviously made some IR reforms in their first term that business didn't like, that they didn't really talk about at all to the general public before the election, but they nonetheless rushed through. I'm interested, Shane, in your take, because the Treasurer, separately but perhaps relationally, the government is also trying to push through these reforms on superannuation balances above $3 million, which will affect very few people, but there has been like a substantial pushback to these reforms and various arguments against them. So Treasurer Jim Chalmers said this week that the fact that there's been so much opposition to the super tax changes doesn't augur well for bigger, broader tax reform. And he said that while many people sort of will say that they favour tax reform in the general principle, when it comes to the specific, they're against it. So what do you think of that? And, I mean, what's the point of having a big economic summit if everyone's going to be like, nope, don't like that idea, nope, don't like that idea?
Yeah, and he was exactly right, because history is well and truly on his side. The Productivity Commission in 2017 put out a really important report called Shifting the Dial, about 140, 150 ideas on how you could make the economy more productive. One of them was introducing a carbon tax. Now, we all know how that flies in this country, where you have some very powerful vested interests, and one side of politics went, oh my God, world is ending. Now, in the world of economics, putting a price on carbon, absolute, that's what you should be doing. But we have chosen to take a more expensive, less efficient, less productive manner in which to deal with climate change and reducing our emissions. So when he talks about big reforms, Chalmers was there next to Wayne Swan when the Henry tax reform paper came out, and it says, right, let's put a special tax in terms of resources. And we had billionaires on the back of trucks saying, look, the people are coming for you. In terms of the superannuation change, some of the complaints about it are absolutely unhinged. And we are talking about 80,000 people who have more than $3 million in their super. And you can have an argument about what this all means, like in terms of should it been explained better? Is there an argument about taxing unrealised gains, which is an aspect of this? Although some of the opponents say, oh my God, they're coming for your unrealised gains. And I say, well, you are already taxed.
They already do.
Land tax and rates, that's unrealised gains. That is being taxed right now. But so his argument,
Don't have to tell me.
This is a guy who has lived through what happens when you come up with this. People talk about the 1980s. There was some, apparently, if you believe some economic historic revisionisms, it was a kumbaya bipartisan approach with John Howard and Paul Keating sitting around a fire strumming a guitar saying, oh, I love your tax reform. Bollocks. Sorry. Capital gains tax and fringe benefits tax were opposed by the Liberal Party all through the 80s. And those two taxes helped pay for Paul Keating's deep cuts in personal income taxes, which was all that area. So every time we get into something substantial, there are always vested interests or people have a different view.
It's always contentious, it's always difficult, and I suppose that's what we're asking, and that's what we will have to see, whether or not the Albanese government is really up for a fight, because Paul Keating was, John Howard and Peter Costello were. So I guess we'll find out. One
very quick point to counter that, Shane. There'll be very few economists who you could find who've been quoted who say that Chalmers' unrealised gains proposal is real tax reform. Yep. They would say it's a real problem he's trying to fix on the concessionality of the super system, but I haven't heard anyone come out and say it's a great way he's doing it.
No, but I will push back again, because this is the argument between economists and financial planners. They are very distinctive differences, and we've had economists who have looked at this who don't understand how tax operates within superannuation. It is a absolutely complex manner, and this is. So, but Paul's broader point, and I don't want to belittle because he's got equal billing with me in this movie with you today.
You're the special.
He is so special. Is that? Look,
I don't want us to have like a horrible argument, like a sort of bitter argument about tax reform on this podcast. But
no, this we'll take it offline.
Yeah, we'll take it offline.
Yeah,
but no, this goes to that broader point that whenever you get into like the super is interesting because the government has chosen to take on the 80,000 wealthiest people in the country. When we talk,
they're poor little easy targets.
Yeah, as opposed to like when we're talking about more broader productivity enhancements. That there will be and people keep talking about what happens to AI. Will that be wiping out jobs at the bottom end, where you'll have the 80,000 at the top whose jobs are very secure saying, yes, we should be doing this reform, and there are millions down the bottom saying, hold on, that's my job. There is always going to be tension when you're going to say, how are we going to be more efficient? How's the economy going to improve? How are living standards going to improve? Because everyone, from you, me, none of us have the 3 million super, but we all have a vested interest.
And almost by definition, the lower skilled jobs are going to be the ones that are the most vulnerable.
That's right.
Paul, I just want to segue quickly to foreign affairs because this week the Australian government did impose sanctions on 2 senior Israeli ministers for their roles in human rights abuses against Palestinians in the West Bank, not in Gaza. It's quite a significant escalation in the Australian government's stance on Israel-Palestine. What does this signal? Why is this happening now? Why are they doing it now?
It is a big step, and it places Australia right at the centre of a pretty significant Western diplomatic move that pits Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Norway and the UK. Obviously, Norway is not in the Five Eyes, but it's all 4 of the Five Eyes security partners other than the US, pits them against the Trump administration who has come out and criticised this move. It's a bold step to sanction members of the actual war cabinet. This is not sanctioning, criminals in the country, as Magnitsky sanctions have previously been used for example, for Russians who are involved in the war who are Putin's oligarchs. This is actual cabinet ministers. So it's a very significant step. The criticism from the coalition and some of the Jewish Israeli groups in Australia is that these Magnitsky laws should only be used for, as I said, kind of criminals who are linked to non-democratically elected governments. The Labor government's argument is that these ministers are extremists. They not only advocate for violence, but they actually use their power in the government to help create violence. The example that
incite
it and create it through the provision of arms to violent settlers in the West Bank, and crime in the West Bank against Palestinians has been growing. But even though the legal basis for these moves was about Israeli settler violence, this is kind of inextricably linked, and Penny Wong is open about this with what's going on in Gaza. The Australian government is fed up and believes that the Israelis are no longer listening and that a step like this was necessary.
Okay, so they've reached a tipping point with the whole issue and they want to push back harder than they previously have.
And I would also just add, yes, I think that's right, but also the political environment in Australia is pretty radically changed because they've had a commanding election win. The debate around anti-Semitism locally has subsided, even though it's still a real problem. And Peter Dutton, who was extremely vocal and focused on this issue, is no longer in Parliament.
Sure. And yet we continue to see these sort of horrific images, particularly from Gaza, as you say, on our TVs every night.
Yeah, they're shocking.
We heard later in the week that the Trump administration will be reviewing Orcus, Scott Morrison's great achievement, part of which was the justification for his Order of Australia. Does that put the Orcus multi-billion-dollar deal in doubt, or is this just sort of something that the Trump administration will tick off on?
Well, the Orcus critics who will never miss an opportunity to stick their head up and talk about how much they hate Orcus, such as Malcolm Turnbull and Bob Carr, and I'm sure more will come out as the day rolls on.
Orcus haters.
Orcus haters. Haters going to hate Orcus. They would have you believe that this is the kind of death knell of Orcus, that this review was an inevitability because the deal was bad from the get-go and doesn't work for Australia, doesn't work for the US. They don't have the shipbuilding capacity, and that this will lead to a death spiral for the project. But there have been other experts quoted today, and speaking to political and defence sources today, there's also a lot of caution on that side. And in the government, there is a view that this is a review to put pressure on Australia to speed things up, to show more vociferous public support for the US's role in Asia and for the role that AUKUS will play in combating China. There is a view among US officials that Australia is kind of hush-hush about the true intentions of AUKUS, and that is something that displeases Elbridge Colby, who's the US Defence Undersecretary who's leading this and who has been an AUKUS skeptic in the past, although he's become a bit more positive of late, and that this is effectively leverage, and AUKUS will continue.
Is there going to be a little bit of I don't know, I don't want to call it blackmail because that's too strong, but a little bit of subtle pressure saying, they obviously want us to increase our defence spending. They want everybody to increase their defence spending. Will there be some sort of quid pro quo there? Like, we'll continue with AUKUS, we'll honour AUKUS, but you need to increase your defence spending as a percentage of GDP.
I think you're right using the term blackmail. Have a look at what Trump has done with.
I mean, that's how Trump rolls. Let's not.
No. I don't want to give. Like the Pew Research Centre report that came out this week showing Australians are just behind Sweden in thinking that Donald Trump is dumb, dangerous and dishonest. The number of Australians who think he is dishonest is in the 80% mark. But brought it to the blackmail argument, look at how he has dealt with from Greenland to Ukraine to broader Europe. It is blackmail. We are seeing being played out. And in terms of the language around Trump, I think what we are seeing playing out is historically astonishing. And I think to say, oh, no, we can't go that far. No. Let's go hard. Let's go hard, Jackie.
Right.
Let's go hard.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, we saw it even in his dealings with Elon Musk this week. As Jonathan Swan, former Sydney Morning Herald journalist, now New York Times journalist, said, his threat to Elon Musk was like very sort of, what did he say? It was like, nice companies you got there. Be shame if something happened to them.
Exactly.
It's very Standover tactics. It's very mafioso.
The push for Australia and other allies to increase defence spending did predate the Trump administration. Like the Biden administration was also trying to get the other nations' defences up to reduce reliance on the US. I'm not going to defend the way Trump does diplomacy, but I think the Americans have some right to tell their allies, hey, we spend a truckload around the country helping you defend yourselves. You can do a bit more yourself. Yeah,
and that's also their argument with NATO, and there is a very strong argument with NATO. As you say, it's just the tactics and the pressure. Gentlemen, fascinating as ever. Thanks for bringing the fun into productivity.
Well, this is why I'm a special guest star, because I can do that. Let's be honest about it here,
Jackie. The pizzazz into
Jackie.
productivity. Yeah, you are. We'll have you back on very soon. Paul, we won't be seeing you next week because you're going on holiday, which is selfish, but we'll see you soon.
I might be reading your book, Jackie, because I bought it the other day and it was signed by the author, and the woman at reading said, oh, is she your colleague? I wish she'd write more. It was a brilliant book.
There you go. Oh, that's really nice.
That's a call for Jackie to be more productive.
I'll get ChatGPT. Today's episode was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel with technical assistance from Josh Towers. Our executive producer is Chammy Mills, and Tom McKendrick is our head of audio. To listen to our episodes as soon as they drop, follow Inside Politics on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. To stay up to date with all the political news and exclusives, visit The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald websites. To support our journalism, subscribe to us by visiting The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. Thank you for listening.